What's up YouTube, my name is Dom and this is my playthrough of Pokémon Fire Red using only poison types, with hardcore Nuzlocke rules. The basic ones are as follows: I can only catch the first poison type in each route, any Pokemon that faints is considered dead, I may not overlevel past the gym leader's ace, and I may not use any items in battle, but held items are okay. The one exception to these rules is that I do allow catching a Pokemon purely for a dex entry or using HMs, but only poison types are allowed in battle. With that being said, this is my playthrough of Pokemon Fire Red using only poison types. I hope you guys enjoy. I choose Bulbasaur as he's the only poison starter, then I name him Booba because it seems like Boobs was bad luck. I lost like over 10 times, so I figured a new name might be worthwhile. After beating the shit out of Gary's Pokemon, I immediately make my way towards Viridian Forest until I find a Weedle on Route 2. While making my way through Viridian Forest, I train Weedman until he evolves into a Kakuna, then again do a Beedrill. Booba also levels up and learns Vine Whip, which I then use to completely destroy Brock while not thinking at all. This fight is definitely one of the easiest by far. I then make my way towards Mount Moon, and on the way we find our next encounter, Nidoran. We name him King Kunta. Immediately after, we go into Mount Moon and find another encounter, a Zubat which we name Zuko. Not a very original name, but it'll do. Right after we destroy this hiker and evolve Booba into an Ivysaur, we find another encounter, Ekans, which luckily did come with Intimidate, which is pretty much the only thing that makes Ekans useful in my opinion. And we named him Scaly. We then make it to Nugget Bridge and run into Blue. He sends out Pidgeotto, we lead with King Kunta, and we actually just easily take it out with a couple double kicks. Then immediately kill Abra as well with Peck since it's pretty much useless. We double kick Rattata and get the KO as well on him, and then Blue sends in Charmander, which we double kick, then switch out to Scaly, then go for a Poison Sting, but we don't get the proc. Next turn, I just decide to take the risk and switch into Booba, and then I immediately go for a Sleep Powder. We then just tackle him for the easy KO. Right after that, we go towards Misty, and we lead with Booba and spam Vine Whip on Staryu. Then we go for a Vine Whip on Starmie as well. It did a little under half, and I didn't really want to deal with any potions, so I go for a Leech Seed the next turn to bait an attack, and Starmie hits Booba pretty hard, but Booba ends up winning, and the Vine Whip plus Leech Seed ends up being enough to KO. Immediately after beating Misty, we use a Moonstone on King Kunta in order to get a Nidoking, which is extremely useful early game. Right above Nugget Bridge, we end up finding an Oddish we name Oddity. We just end up boxing him for now though, since the only real use we have for it is just in case Booba dies, so yeah, he's not really going to be useful right now. We then make our way towards Vermillion and decimated a Team Rocket Grunt who decides to give us the TM for Dig, which we then teach to King Kunta, which will be extremely crucial for the next gym leader. We then go to the SS Sand and fight Blue again, and easily sweep him with Nidoking. You're going to notice a huge pattern with a lot of these fights in this game, and a lot of them are just honestly handled by one Pokemon. We then make our way to the Vermillion Gym, which is honestly one of the most annoying puzzles in all of Pokemon. There's no skill involved in your decision making, it's just RNG based on whether or not you pick the right two tiles in a row, so it's extremely annoying. It's honestly like so much harder than the actual battle itself and way more time consuming. In the actual battle, all I did was just spam Dig with Nidoking since all of his Pokemon pretty much could do nothing towards me. We then made our way to Rock Tunnel after beating Lieutenant Surge. Now, on the way there, Zuko leveled up and evolved into a Golbat. After making our way through Rock Tunnel, we immediately head towards Celadon City where we can battle Erica, the Grass Gym Leader. This gym is pretty much soloed entirely by Zuko, and we just spam Wing Attack on everything in our path until they stop breathing. Zuko did get paralyzed, but Grass types really cannot touch him at all, so it just delayed the inevitable. We then make our way towards the Rocket Game Corner. We bully a Grunt into giving us the Lift Key, then battle Giovanni, who has one big threat, Kangaskhan, which is pretty tanky and has access to Stab Mega Punch, which can do some serious neutral damage to pretty much our entire team. But since we beat Erica though, we are a little over leveled since there's not a clear order in what to do in these games. If we went the opposite route and battled Giovanni first, we likely would have passed the level cap before beating Erica, which kind of would defeat the purpose of our rules, so that's why I fought her first. Giovanni does lead with Onyx though, and we lead with Booba because we know he has a Rhyhorn in the back as well, so we get 2 easy KOs with Vine Whip. We then go for a Sleep Powder on Kangaskhan, but unfortunately flinch, so we just go for it again. This time it hits, and Kangaskhan for some reason uses Tail Whip. We then decide to Leech Seed before switching out into King Kunta, who then just uses Double Kick twice for the easy KO on Kangaskhan. We now have access to the Pokemon Tower and find Blue waiting for us at the bottom. For this fight, we lead with King Kunta and immediately KO his Pidgeotto with Rock Slide. And then we go for another Rock Slide on Execute because I honestly figured I'd give Blue a chance in this fight considering we're also over leveled slightly in this fight. We then switch to Zuko and get put to sleep. We decide to stay in and Execute goes for Confusion, which does decent damage despite the level difference. We might have actually lost Zuko here if we didn't have a couple levels over. We then go for Wing Attack again but stay asleep, which gives Execute a chance to set up their own Leech Seed, but it doesn't really matter too much because we hit it pretty hard with Wing Attack the next turn. I know I outspeed though, so I decide to go for another Wing Attack which ends up getting the kill. However, the Leech Seed does proc after, and Zuko does get put in a red, which forces me to switch out Zuko, because he will die even if we OHKO the Kadabra. We then decide to send in Kunta, who takes decent damage from Confusion. We then decide to use Dig for a stab physical move and destroy Kadabra. Blue then sends in Gyarados and he gets an Intimidate off, but we still decide to go for a Rock Slide, which misses. Gyarados does respond with a Thrash and does big damage to Kunta, and I wasn't really ready for Gyarados to hit so hard, so we decide to switch into Scary, which gets an Intimidate of his own off. He tanks a Thrash fairly well after it. We then pivot into Boopa, who can tank a Thrash all day if Gyarados doesn't crit. We go for a Razor Leaf to scout the damage, and Gyarados just goes for another Thrash. We put Gyarados to sleep, and go for a Leech Seed the next turn. Gyarados then immediately wakes up but hits himself in Confusion. We then go for another Sleep Powder, but it misses. We get hit with another Thrash. The next move finally killed. Luckily Gyarados stays asleep anyways, and Leech Seed takes him out. Finally, Blue sends out his Charmeleon, which we decide to risk staying in on since we didn't really have many switch options. We go for Sleep Powder and it luckily connects. We then pivot to Kunta, but Charmeleon immediately wakes up and attacks. Thank God he doesn't have Flamethrower yet. Kunta still takes decent damage from Ember, but the next turn he finishes Charmeleon with a Dig for the win after outspeeding. Immediately after, we catch a Ghastly and name it Ghast. After some training, we do level it up into a Haunter, and then immediately go get the Item Finder to get leftovers from both of the Snorlax since we got the Poke Flute from Mr. Fuji. Our next stop is Koga, which is pretty much a cakewalk considering none of his Pokemon can really do any damage to us, and we have a Haunter and Nidoking in the back in case I need to switch for some weird reason. I taught Ghast Psychic also, so we lead with him, immediately OHKOing the Coughing, then we go for Psychic on Muck, which then uses Minimize. For some reason, luckily Koga didn't try to stall and heal, so we hit the next Psychic for another KO. He then sends in another Coughing who gets obliterated by Ghast. His final Pokemon is Weezing, which surprisingly tanks our Psychic, and then we decide to use Shadow Punch to get him slightly weak so he doesn't heal. It doesn't matter anyways because he lives the next Psychic and starts the process all over again. It doesn't matter though as we completely wall Weezing, so we just Shadow Punch and Psychic him to death. Koga does give us the TM for Toxic here, but since I'm fairly new to Nuzlocking, I figure I'd try and stray away from abusing Toxic strats. Before we move on to Sabrina, there is another encounter that will be crucial to this playthrough, and this is our only water encounter, a Tentacool. We name her Tentabool, then immediately grind until she hits level 30 and evolves into Tentacruel. We then go to the Rocket Game Corner, blow all of our money on coins, then spend all 4,000 on the TM for Ice Beam and teach it to Tentacool. We then head on towards Silph Co, where we get into one of the harder fights in this game. We know Blue is going to lead with the Pidgeot, so we lead with Kunta and immediately go for a Rock Slide, and we get a lucky flinch, which means we get a free KO on Pidgeot. We then switch into Zuko, who gets paralyzed on the switch in, but we still decide to get some damage on to execute, so we go for a wing attack since we don't really have a switch in yet. We go for another wing attack and actually manage to take him out. In this fight, luckily Blue's Alakazam doesn't have Psychic yet, so after he pivots into Alakazam, we are able to switch into Kunta. We immediately go for Dig, and Alakazam goes for Future Sight. We then go for Dig again, and the AI still goes for Future Sight, which fails. We luckily then outspeed the next turn and just go for Rock Slide expecting to switch in, but we don't get it, which doesn't really matter, but I honestly thought the AI would maybe try and switch Gyarados in. We immediately switch to Booba, and Gyarados thankfully just goes for Dragon Rage instead of Thrash. We then hit Sleep Powder on the next turn and then try to set up a Leech Seed, but we miss. We do hit the next one, then go for Razor Leaf on the next turn, and Gyarados wakes up and uses Bite. We then put him back to sleep, then go for Razor Leaf and crit, which does end up killing the Gyarados. Blue then sends his Charizard, and we immediately switch to Tentabool thinking he'll go for a fire move, but he just uses Smokescreen. We then get hit by a wing attack, which we take decently well, then take out Charizard and win the battle with no casualties. After beating Blue, we make our way to Giovanni, who is a mediocre team mostly carried by Kangaskhan. We lead with Tentabool due to his general coverage, but we know we'll have to switch if Kanga comes in. We go for Surf and take minor damage and get the easy KO. The next Pokemon is of course Kanga, so we switch to Haunter, which completely destroys Kanga, as this one does not have Scrappy. He has no attacking moves that can hit a ghost type. Giovanni then sends into his Rhyhorn, and I'm slightly worried about a crit, so we switch into Booba just to be safe. Of course he just uses Scary Face though, so we're completely fine. And then Giovanni sends in Nidoqueen. Pretty much wall it completely, so we just put it to sleep, then get the free switch into Tentabool and use Surf, which only did just under half. But Nidoqueen doesn't have Earthquake yet, so we decide to stay in and use Surf again. And she just uses Poison Sting. The AI is so bad sometimes, it's actually crazy knowing this was like my 20th attempt at this run. The next fight is probably one of the ones that I struggled with the most, and I finally came up with a decent plan after losing to her multiple times. We lead with Booba since he has Sleep Powder, and we need to be able to set up Beedrill to outspeed Alakazam. We'll definitely one-shot our entire team if we don't kill him in one shot. Kadabra did outspeed us, but it luckily just only went for Future Sight, which should be fine. We then use this turn to switch into Weedman. Kadabra stays asleep, but we take the Future Sight, which does pretty mediocre damage. Kadabra does end up outspeeding us this turn, but thank God he stays asleep, which turns this battle from almost completely unwinnable to a complete GG. We then use Twinneedle on Kadabra, which KOs. Sabrina then sends in Mr. Mime, and Twinneedle also OHKOs since Mr. Mime is not Fairy type in this game. She then sends in Alakazam, which kind of made me hesitate a little, but Twinneedle does end up getting the OHKO, and Sabrina then sends in Venomoth, her final Pokemon. We then decide to switch into Kunta and tank a Psybeam, and then go for Rock Slide, but it surprisingly doesn't kill. We then send in Tentable for a cleanup, and of course Sabrina uses a Hyper Potion. For some reason thought Venomoth was a poison flying type here, so instead of Surf, I just went for Ice Beam, which kills in 2 hits anyways. We win without losing a single Pokemon, which I honestly don't think I did until this run. We then immediately head over to Cinnabar Island, where we end up getting our next encounter, a Coughing. I decided to name it Turbo after tuberculosis, but his name really isn't that important because he just immediately gets boxed. We then head on over to the gym after finding the key inside Pokemon Mansion. Completely roll over the entire gym so mad that I didn't even bother trying to do the puzzles. Just spam Surf on every trainer until we made it to the end. After we get to Blaine, I again just click Surf until everything died. His Arcanine and Rapidash did take 2 hits instead of 1. They're pretty much useless against any water type. Bill does try to distract us by taking us to the islands, and we just bully a bunch of bikers until we level up enough to take on Giovanni, the final gym leader. He is a ground type trainer, which is kind of underwhelming since in this gen there's not many great ground types that don't get completely destroyed by water or grass types, which we have both of. Anyways, we decide to lead with Tentable and go for Surf, which does OHKO. Giovanni then sends in Dugtrio, which can be kind of scary if he outsped, but Tentacool is a beast and outspeeds an OHKOs. I think Giovanni clearly realizes that he's getting destroyed, and he tries to send in his ace, Rhyhorn, but it doesn't really matter because we just OHKO it next turn anyways. He then sends in his Nidoqueen, which does survive our next Surf, but we manage to live in Earthquake. But after he tries to spam Hyper Potions, we end up KOing and healing up quite a bit with our leftovers while we got stalled out. I wasn't honestly sure if Tentacruel would OHKO, so just to be safe we switched to Gas, which in this gen still has Levitate, so we completely ignore Nidoking's Earthquake. We then go for a Psychic and OHKO Nidoking to get the last badge. Our next fight is with Blue, and this is probably even more scary of a fight than the last one at Silph Co, because now Blue's Alakazam knows Psychic. Because we know he can OHKO our entire team, we send out Booba despite being weak to Pidgeot, and then try to do the setup strat we use on Sabrina. We do hit the Sleep Powder, and the next turn we go for Leech Seed in order to stall out the Pidgeot. We then go for Razor Leaf and it crits, but we almost do nothing considering it was a crit. I then go for Growth since I still need to stall, and Pidgeot finally wakes up and hits us with Wing Attack, which we take fairly well after Leech Seed and leftovers. We then put Pidgeot back to sleep, then take the opportunity to pivot into Weedman since we know Alakazam is going to be baited after Pidgeot Feint. Luckily, Pidgeot stays asleep next turn, and we get off a free agility. We mimic a Sabrina sweep here and get the OHKO on the Alakazam, and so this battle becomes so much easier. Blue then tries a revenge kill with Rhyhorn, but we switch to Booba, who eats a Rock Blast. We then immediately OHKO Rhyhorn with Razor Leaf, and Blue sends out his Charizard, which is terrifying now. Since we have Venusaur, we know he's going to go for a fire move, so we use this opportunity to switch into Tentable since he resists and has high special defense. We tank his Flamethrower with ease, then next turn we go for a Surf which does over half, which means after surviving a Wing Attack next turn, we take him out with Surf again. Blue then pivots into Execute, which we might have been able to kill with Ice Beam, but I really didn't want to lose Tentable, so we switched out into Zuko, who gets paralyzed on switching. We then go for Poison Fang, but we end up getting paralyzed. For some reason Execute used Solar Beam, which we completely wall, but we do end up getting paralyzed on the second turn of Solar Beam, of course. Next turn we finally do hit a Poison Fang, but Execute just goes for Solar Beam, so we just kill next turn after he literally just does nothing to Zuko. Blue then sends in Gyarados, which means we have to switch out because we're crippled at this point, and I'm not confident Zuko could take a Thrash or a Hydro Pump. We switch into Booba, and Gyarados actually ends up missing on Hydro Pump, which probably wouldn't have done much at all anyways, since Gyarados doesn't have the greatest special attack, and we resist. Next turn we somehow outspeed though, and we hit the Sleep Powder. Then we go for Leech Seed the next turn as Gyarados sleeps. We go for Razor Leaf and do just about half after the Leech Seed, and I went for Growth not wanting to deal with any Hyper Potions, but Gyarados woke up and used Rain Dance. Next turn we go for the kill, but just barely miss out with Razor Leaf. The Leech Seed is enough to kill, and we move on towards Victory Road. After finishing our levels, we head on towards Lorelei, who's one of the trainers I've been fearing since the beginning, because she absolutely destroyed my team in a different run where Venusaur died earlier on. The reason we want Venusaur is because we need to set up, as Lorelei has a Lapras that can do massive damage to our entire team, OHKOing everything except our Venusaur and Tentacool, the latter of which not being able to do much without teaching it Toxic. Since we have Venusaur this run, we immediately go for the Sleep Powder, which does hit, thank god. We then immediately go for Growth, but Dugong wakes up. He just ends up going for Safeguard, which I thought was good, but then I realized I couldn't put it back to sleep, so I likely had to take an Ice Beam to the face. I decide to risk it and go for another Growth, and Dugong goes for Hail, which is kind of scary if we don't OHKO the Lapras later on, since it'll have a stab ice move in Hail, but I think we'll be okay. I didn't want to risk taking an Ice Beam next turn, so at +2 we go for Giga Drain, which does OHKO the Dugong. Lorelei does send in Slowbro next turn, who is pretty tanky, but I still decide to go for a Giga Drain, and I end up OHKOing it, which came as a surprise. Lorelei does send in her own Lapras afterwards, which I didn't think we could OHKO, but I still went for Giga Drain, figuring she couldn't kill us with one move unless she crit Blizzard. Luckily she doesn't crit and just goes for Ice Beam, which means we can get the easy KO next turn because her Citrus Berry ends up proccing and she doesn't end up using a full restore. Next turn she sends out Jinx, who we underestimated because even at +2 we barely get over half on her, which is pretty surprising because Jinx is a fairly frail Pokemon. Jinx did go for a Lovely Kiss, but she actually ends up missing, which is super nice. Even though she missed though, it didn't really matter because we ran out of PP and Giga Drain, so we'd have to switch regardless. We decided to go into Tenable since he walls Jinx's Ice Punch, but we get frozen. Luckily though, we thaw out the very next turn, and then we try to clean up with Surf, but Jinx just barely holds on. Of course Lorelei uses a full restore. We then go for another Surf and actually crit, which means that the next turn we outspeed and kill. Lorelei's final Pokemon is a Cloyster, which can be kind of scary to switch into, so even though we don't have the best matchup, we go for Barrier while he sets up Hail. Then we just start spamming Surf because Cloyster's special defense is relatively low, so even though it's not very effective, we'll do decent damage. Cloyster does try to set up spikes, but it doesn't really matter because we wall him hard with Tenable and we don't really have a reason to switch at this point. After a few more Surfs, Cloyster does eventually go down and we move on towards Bruno. This fight didn't worry me too much as the only really scary Pokemon was No Guard Machamp, but our typing combined with Gengar's immunity to fighting should make this fight pretty easy. This time, we lead with Tenable since we know Bruno has multiple Onix, which is honestly completely underwhelming for an Elite Four battle, as we just OHKO it immediately. For some reason, Bruno decides to send in another Onix, which we also OHKO. After destroying his snakes, Bruno goes for Hitmonchan and we stand as we aren't really threatened by his moveset at all. We go for a Surf and he just hits us back with a Rock Tomb, which doesn't do much to Tentacle. I figured we could use Hitmonchan's weak attack to set up, so we decide to go into Booba and Hitmonchan goes for a Sky Uppercut, which misses, but it likely wouldn't have done anything to us since we resist. Next turn we decide to go for Sleep Powder, which luckily does hit, so we begin to set up. Hitmonchan actually sleeps for 2 turns, and on the 3rd turn of growth he finally wakes up and hits us with a Rock Tomb, which is useless since we have leftovers. We probably could have gone for more growth, but I think I kind of got impatient, so we decided to just KO instead. Next turn Hitmonlee actually went for a Mega Kick. Thinking Bruno was going to heal next turn, we actually just went for another growth, but he actually just hits a Mega Kick and does decent damage to Booba. Next turn we finally decide to KO and get to nearly full HP, after which Bruno sends in Machamp, which can be kind of scary, so we went for a Sleep Powder, but we miss and Bruno just uses Scary Face, thank god. Next turn we go for another Sleep Powder, but we miss again. Machamp just uses Cross Chop. We finally hit Sleep Powder after Machamp used another Cross Chop, and the next turn we go for Giga Drain. I'm not sure why I didn't just spam growth, as I kind of figured Machamp would just live, but his Citrus Berry does proc, so I just go for Giga Drain again, as I know Bruno wasn't going to heal. This next battle I wasn't really sure how it would go, so we decided to lead with Tenable since we know we can do decent damage without getting obliterated by Gengar. First turn we go for a Surf, which does just under half, and Gengar goes for Double Team. I kind of get worried since I really didn't want to get cheesed, so I go for another Surf instead of switching in hopes of getting a high roll, but of course we miss the Surf, and Gengar gets a free Shadow Punch in. I didn't want to lose any Pokemon just yet, so instead of switching, we decided to go for a Barriers and have all of his damage that he does to us. He does use Confuse Ray on us though, which I really didn't feel like getting cheesed by, so we decided to go into Booba instead, even though we already used Barrier, and tank a Shadow Punch. Next turn we go for a Sleep Powder and also somehow outsped, so we get a free sleep after it hits. We then decide to switch to Nidoking, but Gengar just wakes up and uses Shadow Punch. We just go for Rock Slide and next turn and outspeed, but Gengar doesn't flinch and he hits us with Confuse Ray. We did get him to red though, so since I know she's going to use Full Restore, we use this opportunity to get a free switch into Tenable. We then use Barrier again since I thought it was like Reflect for some weird reason. I don't really know why I did that. And now Gengar is at +2, I'm pretty sure, which is kind of worrisome since he's at +2 with full health. I didn't really know what else to do, so we just switched Zuko in as he knows Aerial Ace. I was just done with the evasion tactics at this point, so we just keep spamming Aerial Ace. She then sends out Haunter and we use Confuse Ray, which does make Connor hurt itself. Next turn we do go for Aerial Ace and get him low, but then he hits Hypnosis. Right here I actually messed up like really big, since for some reason I didn't think her Haunter would have Dream Eater. I thought only her Gengars did. So we actually have our first death since we instantly get one-shotted by Dream Eater. We then send out Gas for the immediate revenge kill and we Shadow Ball it for the one-shot. Agatha then sends out Golbat, and I wasn't sure if we could kill, but decided to risk it for the kill, and we end up leaving him at 1 HP. Next turn we just follow up with another Psychic, which does end up getting the KO. We must have gotten a high roll or something. Next up is Arbok, which is also pretty bad as it has pretty mediocre attack and can't hit us with an Earthquake. We just go for Psychic and hit her into the red, but we don't get the KO. So he just hits us with an Iron Tail, but he luckily doesn't crit. And it did a lot more damage than I thought, but since he didn't crit, we still lived. Agatha then goes for another Full Restore and we just hit it with another Psychic and kill it with a crit. Next turn she sends out her Gengar, and I decided to risk it because I was confident we'd outspeed, but we barely do half damage. In return, we get one-shotted by her Gengar, who of course crits. We then switch into Nidoking to try and finish Gengar with Rock Slide, but she hits a Hypnosis. I know for sure this time that she's going to go for Dream Eater, so I know I have to switch. So I switch to Tenable, and next turn we go for Surf. Somehow one-shot it with Surf, winning us the battle. Next up is Lance, who does have some pretty terrifying Pokemon, but the main threat I'm concerned about is the Aerodactyl, as he is extremely fast and has a physical ancient power which can be tough to handle if we don't kill it with Tenable. We did kind of go in this fight blind, and we end up sending in Tenable instead of Booba, which means we kind of just took a Dragon Rage for no reason because his Gyarados was out, and Tenable can pretty much do nothing against it. We then go for Sleep Powder, and Booba outspeeds so we get a free turn. We then set up a Leech Seed as there isn't much of a way for us to comfortably destroy Gyarados, so we just stall it like before. We go for 3 growths in a row, and then on the third turn Gyarados wakes up and just uses Bite, which does pretty much nothing. At this point we know Gyarados can't do anything to us, so we don't even bother putting it to sleep. After hitting +6, we finally decide to take it out and use Giga Drain. Lance then sends in his Aerodactyl, which I honestly wasn't expecting since Dragonite walls us almost completely. Even with +6, we really can't do much to it at all. I'm confident Venusaur could take one wing attack even with a crit from Aerodactyl, so we decide to stay in and end up healing all the way back to full after one-shotting it. Lance then sends in his Ace, but I figured we could at least whittle him down since Dragonite can be pretty scary if it uses Outrage. We actually go for a Sleep Powder here and put it to sleep, then go for Leech Seed and it luckily hit. Next turn I wasn't sure if Dragonite would wake up or not, so I decided to go for a Giga Drain, which did pretty much nothing. I think here I got kind of impatient because instead of using Giga Drain this turn and using Sleep Powder the next, I just immediately switched into Tenable and let him take a wing attack directly to the face for some weird reason. I don't know why I did that. Luckily though, I have leftovers and Leech Seed, so most of the damage got mitigated. Next turn though, we do outspeed and we OHKO with an Ice Beam. Next up is Dragonair, which I thought would actually get one-shotted, but it does end up living. Of course it only went for Safeguard though, so we just Ice Beam and KO it the next turn. The next Dragonair comes out right after, and it also lives Ice Beam, but it just uses Dragon Rage instead of Outrage. I was so confused. So we just Ice Beam it and actually get the KO to win the battle. It was surprisingly way easier than I thought it would be. I'm pretty sure this was also the first run where we actually made it to Lance. Unbelievable. Our next battle is the final challenge, and by far the hardest battle so far, as Blue has many Pokemon that can OHKO us. Mainly is Charizard and Alakazam. We know Blue always leads with Pidgeot, so we send out Booba because we need to do the Beedrill strat one last time to get rid of his Alakazam, otherwise we probably will lose. First turn, we outspeed and hit the Sleep Powder, then we go for Leech Seed next turn and we hit that as well. Next turn we go for Giga Drain just to scout damage. See that we do about 1/4 of his health, then we get hit with Sand Attack. Next turn we go for a Sleep Powder, but of course we miss, and we get hit with an Aerial Ace. We then go for a Sleep Powder again, but we miss. We get hit with another Aerial Ace, which really starts to worry me as I'm probably dead to a crit even after healing. Luckily though, I decide to risk it, and we actually end up hitting the third Sleep Powder. And we stall out Pidgeot enough to trigger the full restore, meaning we have to do the same thing again, but this time we will have to switch out a Beedrill without waking Pidgeot up. We did use Growth as well, so our Giga Drain will get Pidgeot weaker this time around. So next turn we go for another Sleep Powder, then thankfully hit it. We then use Giga Drain, which does minor damage, but we use this opportunity to switch into Weedman immediately after. Of course though, as soon as we switch into Weedman, we get hit by Aerial Ace and get one shot. At this point, I kind of panicked because I just assumed the battle was over, but I sent in Tenable, who I knew could at least trade out Pidgeot with a free Ice Beam. After KOing Pidgeot, we bait out the Alakazam, who we lose the speed battle to, but thankfully he just used Reflect, so we get a free Surf. Next turn we actually do get hit by Psychic, but that high special defense does allow Tenable to live, and we actually do end up getting the KO with Surf. Next, Blue sends in Rhydon, which we can also easily just one-shot. We somehow are doing pretty well for this battle considering our Beedrill strat did not go to plan. Blue then decides to send in Exeggutor, and I didn't really have a switch in, so I was forced to go for an Ice Beam, which leaves him at 1 HP, but he freezes. But of course, it doesn't really matter, as Exeggutor just immediately thaws out, then goes for a Sleep Powder. Because we healed from leftovers, I decided to stay in because I figured we could at least survive an Egg Bomb if it doesn't crit. So we go for another Ice Beam and do over half, and we don't get crit, so we get the KO on Exeggutor next turn. Blue then sends in Gyarados, which despite being scary with Thrash, I figured we could somehow cheese. So we decided to go into Booba, then we outspeed and hit a Sleep Powder. We then use Leech Seed because we need Tenable to have higher HP before we take on Blue's Charizard. We then pivot into Tenta to start the healing process. Gyarados stays asleep on switch in, and I decided to use an Ice Beam, which does around half. I figured Gyarados would wake up soon, so we decided to use Barrier, which pays off because Gyarados wakes up and immediately uses Thrash, which likely actually could have killed if we didn't use Barrier. We then used Surf to do less damage and figured we could gain more health if we didn't kill Gyarados with Ice Beam, which did pay off. By the time Charizard comes in, we have 120 health, meaning we probably could survive a non-crit wing attack or Slash. Charizard then goes for a Slash, which doesn't do anything since we have a Barrier up and it doesn't crit. We then pretty much get a free Surf, which does less than 1/3, 3rd, and I think we get a low roll because the next turn after taking a Fire Blast to the face, Tentacruel just hits another Surf which nearly kills. The next turn we hit for just over half after blue uses a full restore, and after leftovers, I think as long as Charizard doesn't crit, this is GG's. Charizard does hit a Fire Blast and he hits it really hard, and he even burns us, but we managed to take it out with the Surf, and after countless hours of what felt like meaningless grinding, we beat Pokemon Fire Red using only poison types, and have become the champion of Kanto. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. It may not be the best playthrough of Fire Red, but I hope to show my improvement in future gameplays. So if you liked the video, be sure to subscribe for future content. Peace.